everyone. This is the first of a series of videos on Plato's Phaedo. This is a longer dialogue than the Meno. I know that people were challenged by the Meno last week, and I'm sorry that I'm giving you a more challenging reading for this week. Everything in here is fully understandable, and if you read along with watching the videos, I think within a week, you certainly gain a reading knowledge command of this dialogue. I have absolute faith in you. So it's going to take some work. Like the Meno, the Phaedo lends itself to being read in sections, and each one of these videos will concentrate on what I consider to be a natural section, the way that the dialogue does naturally divide itself up into different divisions. It's just there's more of them, and some of the arguments are more trying, more demanding than the arguments of the Meno. But we'll see. Everybody sort of responds to different readings in different ways. So what do we have here? We have a beginning where Echecrates and Phaedo are talking, and as sometimes happens in the beginnings of Platonic dialogues, the dialogue itself is being narrated from one person to another. That is, Phaedo is narrating this dialogue from memory, which is an important thing to keep in mind. So he's telling Echecrates that he was there the day that Socrates drank the poison. And the background is actually quite well known. I'm sure most of you know it, that Socrates is found guilty of various crimes. As an old man, he was hauled before the court by a group of people, one of whom was Anytus from the Meno, who accused him of basically impiety, religious heterodoxy, and of corrupting the youth of Athens. And he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. There is a very touching, brief dialogue called the Credo, in which his friend visits him a couple days before this takes place to tell him that he can spirit him away, that he can smuggle him out of Athens and save his life. And Socrates decides that that would be unjust. So he voluntarily remains in the jail, knowing that it means his death. And this is the day of his death. And this is an account of this is Phaedo telling Echecrates the story of, basically what was said and what was done in those hours before Socrates, at the end of this dialogue, actually does drink the poison and die. And let's see, where does it? He actually, this introduction with Echecrates is interesting, and he sets the thing up and says here, I will begin at the beginning and endeavor to repeat the entire conversation. So that's what the dialogue is. It's Phaedo who was there, who was one of the people there. Doesn't really take much part in the dialogue, but he was there listening, and it's him telling the entire conversation, he says, repeating the entire conversation that Socrates had, which is quite a long conversation. So I don't know what that means, if we're actually expected to believe that Phaedo remembers everything that was said, or that's, I don't know. Maybe they had better memories than we did. There's some people who believe that. So in any case, the setup here, where Socrates knows that he's going to die. His wife is there, Xanthippe, and then he dismisses her so that he can talk to his friends. And there's some very interesting sort of prologue here. What follows is Socrates being asked by some of his friends, this man Cebes, who becomes very important later on, who says, there's a rumor going around that since you've been in the jail, and he's been in I don't know, for a month or so, maybe waiting for this day for various reasons. His execution was delayed. But there's a rumor going around that he's been writing poetry while he's there, which is something that Socrates never did. Something very strange. So Socrates explains that he had a dream that told him to make music, and he tried to interpret that as a pious man to say that he should write poetry. And so That's what he was doing. And then the dialogue, uh, in a sort of jocular way, gets to the subject, the main subject of death, when Socrates says, here, then he, and it's just this character, Evenus, then he or any man who has the spirit of philosophy but willing to die, though he will not take his own life, for that is held not to be right. Um, and what follows is Socrates explaining that. That is, that if you are a philosopher, you should be willing to die. And as we find, he goes farther than that, um, in saying that first he says you can't kill yourself. Suicide is impious because we belong to the gods in a way. And by killing ourselves, we would be, in a way, stealing from or robbing the gods. But the real interest in what he said is not that. It's this notion that if you're a philosopher, you should be willing to die. And he goes farther and says that if you're a philosopher, you should not only be willing to die, but you should look forward to death. And that becomes really the first philosophical question, I would say, of any real substance that he goes into. And here we are. You can see that there's no page numbers, but there are these what are called Stephanus numbers that will guide us, that are references to pagination of a very old manuscript of Plato's dialogue. So here at 64a, where Socrates actually begins to try to explain why he would say that if you're a philosopher, that you should not only be willing to die, but that you should look forward to death. And it's a um, very interesting reason that he says this. What is also quite important is here, now we're at 64c, but just below this, Socrates asks at 64c a very important question of his friends. Simmias, he's talking to here. He says, but let us leave them and have a word with ourselves. Do we believe that there is such a thing as death? To be sure, replied Simmias. And is this anything but the separation of psyche, which is the Greek word for soul, or it's usually Jowett, the translator, translated as soul, but the editor of this decided to leave in the original Greek word psyche, which is usually, and I think rightly, translated as soul. So I don't want to have to give a mini lecture on the word psyche, which I'm really not. My Greek isn't good enough to do, but usually that word psyche is normally translated into soul, and so we have a definition of death. It's the separation of soul and body. Now, we'll come back to that definition because it's quite important for understanding what Plato's got to do in this dialogue, because this initial definition of death as the separation of soul and body, or psyche, the original Greek for soul and body, that this is never questioned. That is, Socrates says, just asks dialectically, he says, well, can we agree that death is the separation of soul and body? And Simmias says, sure, yeah, that's what death is. It's when body and soul go in their separate ways. We'll see that the overall problem or goal, problem to be solved philosophically of this dialogue is whether after the separation of soul and body, whether soul goes on and lives independently of body. That's really the major question of this dialogue, is whether the soul is immortal, surely, but firstly, whether after death the soul can exist at all. So that's a question that isn't immediately dealt with here, but it's one that returns because it's the question is left hanging, really. And but that's not Socrates' immediate concern in this section of the dialogue. What he wants to lay out is a certain theory of what it means to be a philosopher, and the idea that what the philosopher wants can only be gotten after death, once the separation of soul and body has occurred. Again, you can see that the Greek word here it is again, psyche. Psyche. It's where we get the word psychology and psyche and anything having to do with the mind, but it really means soul. He continually says, well, philosophers are concerned with psyche, with soul, not with body. Right? And that philosophers are characterized by a love of knowledge. That's what the word means, philosopher, being a lover of knowledge. So that, as he begins to explain, if the soul separates from body, and then if we assume that it lives on free from body, and as he says, if body is a hindrance to knowledge, and this is where things get maybe a little more contentious philosophically, that the soul freed from the body, that is, the soul independent of body and independent of the senses, much like Krishna would say, that is, that sense perception is an illusion. It doesn't give us any truth. Right? We see that Socrates thinks in a very similar way. Here, just above 65c, he says, then when he said, does the psyche or the soul attain truth? For in attempting to consider anything in company with the body, it is obviously deceived. That is, the body is connected up with sense perception, with the senses. And if the senses don't put us in touch with anything true, then, as he says, that the body is a hindrance to knowledge. And the kind of things that Socrates considers to be knowledge, as he says here, is there or is there not an absolute justice and absolute beauty and absolute good? These are what this kind of absolute knowledge of these things is what the philosopher wants to get. Socrates says, did you ever behold any of them with your eyes? And the answer from Simmias, I guess, here is certainly not. Or did you ever reach them with any other bodily sense? And the answer says no. So what he's building is an idea that once once the soul or psyche is freed from the body, that now, because it's no longer trammeled with the illusions of sense perception, that it can get in touch with these things like the absolute beauty, absolute good, which are purely conceptual, intellectual things. So that now the psyche is freed from the body, freed not only from sense illusion, but from desire and all these other things that distract us from truth. That it can now, after death, the soul attain true knowledge. Let's just read a little bit, maybe right here, around 66e. And he says, and all experience shows that if we would have pure knowledge of anything, we must be quit of the body, and the psyche, soul, in itself must behold all things in themselves. Then I suppose that we shall attain that which we desire. If we're philosophers, we desire knowledge. And of which we say that we are lovers. Again, I'm right here. And that is wisdom, not while we live, but after death, as the argument indicates. For if while in company with the body, the psyche, the soul, cannot have pure knowledge, one of two things seems to follow. Either knowledge is not to be attained at all, or, if at all, after death. So Socrates has started the dialogue essentially by saying something very provocative, and that is that the philosopher welcomes death. That if you're truly philosophical, you're not only not afraid of death, you're not only willing to die, but you actually welcome death, because death, being the separation of soul and body, means the liberation of soul or psyche from body, and the possibility, finally, for the philosopher freed from the body, of true knowledge. And that knowledge is of a purely intellectual kind, knowledge of absolute good or good in itself, beauty in itself, justice in itself. No longer, as Krishna might say, no longer incarnated and muddled with sense perception and material things, but a pure idea. So it's a quite heroic thing, this notion, this again, the true philosophers and they only study and are eager to release the psyche, release the soul. So when death comes, it's a fulfillment of that. Right? So it's actually quite beautiful, this beginning part of the dialogue. It goes on to be just a heroic description of the philosophical life. It goes on to be the other virtues besides the pursuit of knowledge, besides wisdom that the philosopher has. Or it's really Plato and Socrates' most heartfelt, I don't say praise of the philosophical life and the true philosopher. So, so this takes us up to about like right here, 70A, and I would say that's the first part of the dialogue. And it's very impressive in itself, and it presents some really interesting ideas about what the nature of death is, and especially the central question of this first part is this notion that the philosopher welcomes death because it's only after death that they get true knowledge. The beginning of the second part of the dialogue comes right here at 70A from Siebes, one of the men who's listened to this, who says, I agree, Socrates, in the greater part of what you say, but in what relates to the psyche, to the soul, men are apt to be incredulous. They fear that when it leaves the body, its place may be nowhere, and then that on the very day of death, it may be destroyed and perish immediately on its release from the body. That is, Siebes, in a kind of a hesitating way, is pointing out something that's very true about what Socrates has said, and that he's just assumed that after the separation, remember, he's defined death as the separation of soul and body, and he has merely assumed that after that separation, that soul goes on to exist independently of body. And what Siebes is saying is that it's not obvious at all. That is not the kind of thing that you can simply assume. And it's the very type of thing that you really need to prove. And in a way, that's what the rest of the dialogue really is as we'll see, is Socrates' attempt to prove that indeed the soul does go on and live its own independent existence separate from the body.